Welcome to the Josh Huisman Podcast.
Welcome to another exciting week of the Josh Huisman Podcast, and I have one of my good friends here, known him for many years now, and this episode is going to be a big-time blessing to someone. It's also going to be, I have been praying, and I know you always pray this, that when someone hears this testimony, that they will either pull their car over on the side of the road, stop running, whatever it may be, and they just give their life to Christ, because this is a testimony from my friend Tom Thompson here, that from the first moment I heard it, made me think, there's no denying that there is a God, and there is no denying that it is Jesus working on behalf of, even in the hardest things, Jesus is at work. And so Tom is here today. Tom, say hello. How are you doing? Tom Thompson.
Hello, everybody. Nice to be here.
Yeah. So, all right, let's get into this, because we're going to call this one of the best testimonies I think you could ever hear. And you know, did you think you'd ever be part of one of the best testimonies that somebody would hear?
Depends at which point of my life, but for a much earlier part of my life, definitely not. But,
So just to get the elephant out of the room, would you call yourself a perfect person? Have you lived a perfect life?
Let's say no. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's why I come here, because there's,
not a whole lot of perfect people.
Not a whole lot of perfect people at New Hope. It's wonderful.
It's wonderful. All right. So I'm going to bookend this before we jump into the testimony. You are involved with Tennessee Action Council, which is a ministry, a mission that we support here at New Hope, that has two wings of it, which is Project Life, which helps with mobile units, providing free ultrasounds and equipment, and helping pregnant mothers to make the decision to keep their child. And the other wing of it is called Helping Hands. And Helping Hands, basically what you all do is help children who are entering the foster care system.
Correct.
So many times, and this has even been depicted in movies, when a child is being moved into foster care, a lot of times workers will show up with a garbage bag and say, here, put your stuff in it, and we're going to take you out. And it just sets a worthless tone.
Yeah, it's degrading. Sure.
Right. And Helping Hands has been raising money and doing all types of things to get nice bags, to get nice things for these kids so that they can not feel like they're just putting their things into garbage. Mm-hmm. Yep. So there's an event coming up on September 21st. It's a Thursday, right?
Thursday night.
Thursday night, where they're doing a fundraiser. We're going to talk about it. It's called an Unspoken event. The band Unspoken is going to be there playing a show. There's going to be a dinner. Tickets are $150. Student tickets are $75. And special guest speaker who's going to be doing a presentation is Matt Higgins of Hope Children's Home.
Right.
And that's an event. It's happening at Old Natchez Country Club in Franklin, Tennessee. For anybody who's in the area who wants to be a part of this, I highly recommend it, on September 21st. And, before we jump into your testimony, what gave you a heart to get involved with this?
I don't know. I was asked about it, and if I would join the team to help fundraise, and I've done some fundraising for some other missions we support. Mm-hmm. And I guess God just led me to it. I felt called to it, and it's 80% of people who are incarcerated, it's that high. Over 80% at some point went through the foster care system, and so it's just a chance for us to impact these lives in some way, give these kids some dignity at the lowest point of their lives when they're being yanked from their homes. And it's really been a neat ministry. It's a fairly young ministry. Concept started about 3 years ago, and this is our second fundraiser now. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's wonderful. And even if you can't attend, if you're not in the Nashville area, if you go to projectlifefortn.org, I believe it gives all the information of what the Tennessee Action Council is all up to, and I highly recommend it. I'll put that in the show notes to make sure that if people want to go and click the link, that they can go to the website and check it out. So
Perfect. Yep.
Let's talk about you a little bit here. All right. So How about we start from the beginning? Let me just ask you a question that is very simple for me to answer. I'm from Chicago, Illinois. That's where I grew up. South side of Chicago, where the sports teams are not good. And that's easy for me to say. Where are you from?
Well, that's a little more difficult. But as a missionary's kid, I was the fifth child. And I was born in the United States, but was at the very end of my parents' furlough. I was born in Pennsylvania, and just a few weeks later, we were on a ship back to Cambodia. So in 1949, Ed and Ruth Thompson, they completed seminary in Nyack, New York, and hopped on a ship with the little Willie's Jeep.
A ship?
Yes, a freighter.
Really?
Yeah.
With how many kids?
With 4 kids at the time when they first went. Oh, no, actually, there was 1 kid when they first went, and the other 3 were born there in Cambodia.
Was it one of those all-inclusive, like, food ships? And my goodness.
It was all-inclusive if you brought it with you.
Okay, so you're on a ship, you're going to Cambodia?
Right.
Okay. So what were your parents independent missionaries, or who were they working with?
No, they were with Christian and Missionary Alliance, CNMA.
Okay.
Yeah. And so they went and settled in a little town called Karache on the Mekong River, and they began a ministry with working with the Cambodian people. So.
Wow. And the ministry was it a service ministry, preaching? What were they particularly?
Preaching, teaching, sharing the gospel, planting churches, although it was a difficult ministry. Even after 10 years, there was just one small church, maybe 20 or 30 Christians. I'm sure they may have second-guessed themselves a bit and saying, was this really the calling? And I'm sure they may have been frustrated, but that's what they did for the first 10 years. What's interesting is year 10, they were visited by a tribal chief from the Manong tribe, and they numbered about 10,000 tribal people across about 30 villages. And he had a translator with him. He came and knocked on our door and looking for my father. And he said, my tribe, we believe in a heavenly God, but we don't know who he is. And we heard that you might be able to tell us, right? And they had some stories that were passed down from generation to generation about a God, but they wanted to learn more. And so, of course, my father was very excited. And so he started another ministry. For 6 years, he had a little Norton motorcycle, and he would drive up to these villages. Sometimes he'd have to park and walk the last 5 or 10 miles to get there. And he began sharing the gospel with the Manong tribe for 6 years. And then following that, in 1965, all missionaries were kicked out of Cambodia, and no more religious freedom. What was really interesting is even at the end of 6 years, there wasn't a single Christian, and these were people who wanted to know. So imagine that frustration.
Yeah, right.
Probably amplified or continued. They didn't understand it, but then they were called to relocate across the border to a town called Ba Mi Thuot in Vietnam.
So
at that time.
So that you said after 6 years?
6 years in that ministry, so from 1949 to 1965.
How old are you at that point?
About 4 or 5, somewhere around there.
Yeah. So you really couldn't speak to how emotionally that they were doing in that.
No, not at all.
Especially that would be so difficult to go spending years serving and not feeling like you're seeing the fruit that you might want to see.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so where did you say they went from? Then Cambodia kicks them out, and they go to
Ba Mi Thuot, just across the border, which is up in the central highlands of Vietnam, about 300 kilometers north of Saigon, or what's now known as Ho Chi Minh City.
Okay.
Yeah, and they had to start over, so they had to learn a new language. They began working with the Rade tribe. There were about 72 different tribes in Vietnam, but that was the one that they were called to begin to work with. So they had to learn Vietnamese, they had to learn Rade, and they began planting a church for the Rade tribe. And my father was building a home, a small, call it a home, kind of a cabin up near the border, because there were a lot of Manong people that he had worked with that were very close to the border. He was hoping he might still be able to minister kind of across the border to them. So they started over.
It's remarkable. I mean, they talk about how difficult it is as adults to learn different languages. So even when you just say to have to learn these multiple language moving. I couldn't even. I took 4 years of high school Spanish. I took 2 additional years in college Spanish. You know what I know? Hola. ¿Cómo está?
I feel your pain. But there were a lot of comical moments because missionaries learning languages is very entertaining for the people that they're working with. I could assure you.
Yeah. Some highlights. Okay, so success rate was clearly better in Vietnam right away, or no?
Again, they had one small Rade church. Probably, I think they had maybe 20 believers. But, they were starting out. And they were just getting started in that, and then things took a different turn at that point.
How so?
So us kids, we went to boarding school because Bami Tuot was located right near the border, and that's also where the Ho Chi Minh Trail ran during the Vietnam War, and that was the trail where the North Vietnamese would funnel all of their soldiers, their weapons, down to fight against the South Vietnamese Army and against the United States Army as well. So it was a very hotly contested area. It was too dangerous for us kids to go to school there. We did vacation there when we weren't in boarding school, but our boarding school was in Malaysia. So twice a year we'd fly to boarding school for 4 months at a time and then fly home for a couple of months. So we had just left for boarding school in the second week of January. And so it was Laurel, Dale, and I, the 3 youngest. My oldest siblings, David and Judy, had already graduated from boarding school and were back in the U.S. attending college at that time. And on January 29th, so the Vietnamese celebrate New Year's at the end of January, not at the end of our calendar year, and it's called Tet, T-E-T. And I don't know if you've heard of the Tet Offensive, but that was one of the largest battles in Vietnam's history, and the North Vietnamese simultaneously struck 33 different provincial capital cities in Vietnam during that offensive, and Bami Tuot, unfortunately, was one of those cities. And my parents lived on a missionary compound with 5 other missionaries, the Griswold family, the Ziemers, Nurse Ruth Wilting, and Betty Olson. And there was also a leprosarium there, and Betty Olson and Ruth, they worked at the leprosarium, working with the lepers and that were there. Still a major disease at that time in Vietnam. And so when the attack started, at first, the missionaries took shelter in their homes.
Can I start? Had there been attacks or conflicts leading up to that, or
sporadic in different cities? Yeah, different, but nothing this coordinated.
That was
or
about to
widespread.
happen.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, we always heard mortars and gunshots growing up in Vietnam, but that was normal and kind of exciting for us kids, to be honest with you. Because it was normal. It wasn't. We weren't fearful of it, but this was the first attack of that size and coordination across all of South Vietnam.
Okay, so a coordinated conflict comes in. What was the date you said that this happened?
January 29th. Yeah, it was the eve of Tet Offensive. The eve of the Tet celebration, and that's why it's called the Tet Offensive.
Right,
yeah.
And so you're not there.
No, we're at boarding school. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, so what happened?
So initially the missionaries took shelter in their homes, but as the battle became closer to the compound, they realized they probably wouldn't be safe in their homes. And so they discussed going in. There was like a central storage shed, and they decided they would take shelter there. But before the Griswold family was able to leave their home was struck by rockets, and their home collapsed, and both Bob and Carolyn Griswold perished in that. And the other missionaries then moved to the storage shed, and then they realized that would probably become a target. And so my father and Bob Ziemer, they went to the back of the property. We had a hole in the ground for our garbage, basically was our garbage pit. And so they dug out some garbage so that the missionaries would be able to get in there, and they covered it with some boards and some trees to kind of make a makeshift bunker. And my mother and Ruth Wilting and Miriam Ziemer, they climbed in there. Betty Olson was over at the leprosarium, and she ended up getting captured. And she was captured, taken prisoner by the communist soldiers, and she was actually in captivity for almost 2 months after that, and she died of dysentery in captivity. But so they all climbed into the makeshift bunker.
If we could, just to kind of paint a picture here just a little bit. So this attack basically starts happening. Rockets hit the Griswold's home,
right?
Kill them. and which sends your father and another
Bob Zemer.
basically as fast as they can into the garbage pit to try and dig out a shelter. So this is done in a panic,
Yes.
right? And doing everything they can. I mean, and that's got to be pretty gross too. I mean, this is a garbage pit that's full of all, but that doesn't even matter. It's not even registering because you're trying to save your life, and they're digging this out.
Right. Yeah. So they got down in there. Bob Zemer was the last one, and he was getting ready to get in the shelter. But by then, the communist soldiers had scaled the wall of the compound. He was spotted, and so he, I guess not to endanger the others, he walked towards them and took out a white handkerchief to, basically surrender, and or at least attempted to. But they walked up and they shot him and killed him there. And then they walked over to the hole in the ground, and they emptied their AK-47s down into the hole and threw in a couple of grenades for good measure. And then one of the soldiers, I guess, got down to make sure everyone had been killed. Miriam Zemer, by some miracle, had survived all of that, Bob's wife.
Wow.
And she was wounded, but they dragged her out, and for some reason they decided they wanted to take her prisoner. And, of course, she saw the body of her husband laying there, and so they took her prisoner for a couple days. The fighting went on for about 8 days, and the U.S. 155th Helicopter Squadron was also located about 4 or 5 miles away from the missionary compound. And my mom and dad used to go there and preach at their outdoor chapel on Sundays when they weren't in the villages or working with the Rade people, so they knew them very well. So after the fighting stopped, actually before the fighting even stopped, they had abandoned Miriam Zemer on the side of the road. They figured she was a goner anyway.
She was wounded.
She was wounded, and some tribal people found her and actually took her to the Army base, the U.S. Army base, and they life-flighted her down to Nha Trang, and she was flown back to the States. So she survived all this, and she lived. She passed away only about 4 years ago.
Wow!
But it's by her account that we have really all the details of what happened. But when the battle finally ended, the helicopter squadron, along with some F-16 jets from Nha Trang, were able to push the enemy back, and were able to defeat them. Over 10,000 communists were killed, with a complement of 300 Army personnel and their helicopters. So they got in a truck and decided to go over to the missionary compound, see how things worked out, and to find the missionaries. And of course, they found Bob there, and all the homes had been destroyed at that point. And my parents' home was all the homes had been destroyed by the communists at that point. And so they found Bob Zemer outside the bunker. And then there was a soldier there who jumped down into the hole to see, what was in there. And of course, he found the bodies of my mom and dad and Ruth Wilting in there. And they wanted to bring the bodies out, but due to the force of the blast, I guess, from the grenades, at this point, 8 days had gone by. There really wasn't much to bring out, and so they just filled in the hole, and they put a cross on it, and that's where they're still buried today.
Well, and one of those parts of the story that I've heard you talk about before is your mom and dad were holding each other.
My dad had tried to shield both Ruth Wilting and my mom with his body, but again, with what happened, again, it's a miracle that Miriam survived it,
right?
But the others did not.
Yeah. And so, how old were you at this point when
I was
that happened?
8 years old.
8 years old.
In boarding school, yeah.
And so, so mom and dad are gone. You mentioned they had been preaching and they've been doing stuff and serving, but I want to go back to the fruit of it. So, are they seeing people being saved from this and the preaching, or what's
again? It was early. It was early in their ministry with the Rade tribe. So again, it was a small church of 20 or 30 people, and as I got older, I thought back on it, and I remember thinking, really, God? I mean, 16 years in Cambodia, one small church, 6 years with the Manong tribe that wanted to know about you and nothing. And now just, one small church starting over in Vietnam, and it ends in a garbage pit. And, I'm having a hard time seeing God's plan in that.
Right. Did you, as you got older, there's probably a whole story. Who did you have to go live with?
So my mother's sister and her husband, Harriet and George Irwin, were also missionaries in Vietnam. They were up in Dalat, and that town was not impacted by the offensive. And so they adopted us. And so we continued to go to boarding school and go to back to Vietnam and live with them on vacation, and all the way up until 1975 when Vietnam fell. And when Vietnam fell, they had 24 hours to get out of the country. We were at boarding school again, and they only had 24 hours, and they went down to Saigon, and they got out on one of the last two 747s that flew out of Vietnam. It was full of orphan kids. It flew to Guam, and they were on that plane with those orphan kids. So they came back to the States and, consulted with the CNMA about what's next. I'd have probably been ready to retire at that point, but
right.
So since Vietnam was Indochina, right, and French Indochina, so there was a lot of French influence in Vietnam, a lot of architecture there, homes. We lived in a French home when we lived there, an older French home, and so there were a lot of, at the end of the war, there were at least 200,000 that were pouring into France, and so they relocated to France. This is George and Harriet Irwin to plant Vietnamese churches to serve all of the refugees that were coming out of Vietnam. And so I was still going to boarding school in Malaysia. So even though we moved to France for my junior year, I still flew all the way from Paris to Malaysia to go to school, but it got too expensive. And so I finished out my last year at the American School of Paris, not a Christian school.
Yeah,
living in Paris, France. Kind of a social awakening for me. Difficult time for my foster mom and dad, for George and Harriet, for sure. It was a very difficult time. And
well, what does it do to, you mentioned your brothers and your sisters and you. What does that do to you as kids to lose your parents in that way? And, honestly, just to be blunt about it, to maybe be questioning, my parents gave their lives for what?
Yeah.
What did that do to you?
I remember it was a Saturday morning when we were called into the dorm parents' room, or I guess dorm, whatever you call it, and they shared with us what had happened. And I started crying, and my older brother said, Tommy, Mommy, and Daddy went to be with Jesus. Well, I'd always been taught that's where we're trying to go, right? That's the final destination. And so I stopped crying, and to be honest with you, I never really mourned. Because I just believed they were in a better place. It wasn't until I got older that I became cynical about everything that happened. But for my older siblings, David and Judy in college already, and at this point Dale was back in the States, it was pretty tough on them. And Judy was the oldest, so she had to be the spokesperson because she was in Nyack. Of course, all the news agencies came, wanted to interview her, and she struggled with unforgiveness for a long time, admittedly. She really struggled with it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was tough.
So when do you think you started becoming cynical? When did your path start going maybe in a different direction?
Well, when you're a missionary's kid, when you graduate from school, you go back to the States. You're not supported by the mission anymore. And at the time, today we have a halfway house for missionary kids to kind of adapt because, it's kind of a reversal. When you come to the U.S. and you've lived overseas your whole life, the U.S. is culture shock. I remember one year we came back on furlough, and we were at JFK Airport, and after 20 minutes they couldn't find me, and my brother finally found me. And I was flushing the toilet because I'd never seen that before.
Yeah, look at that.
Water was spinning around and disappearing. It was pretty cool. But so I came back to the States, and I went to live with an aunt and uncle, a good Christian family. But, growing up I had a lot of religion. I went to, where I was immersed in it. I'd read the Bible 4 times, church 4 days a week. There were a lot of good things about it. I loved going to the villages at Christmas, and all the trips to the villages were always really cool because we were honored with a feast, and it was just really a neat experience. But to me, God was kind of dark and scary, and wasn't a lot of grace back then in our family, and I was always living under that cloud of fear that if I wasn't perfect, hadn't asked for forgiveness, and something happened, I might not go to heaven, And so when I finally got back on my own, I just, I didn't want that anymore. I just decided I would pursue happiness and my own strength. And I remember, I stayed with that family for a couple of weeks, and I didn't want to be with them anymore, so I ran away and lived in a city park in Detroit Lakes, Minnesota, and got a job stuffing turkeys at a turkey plant. And eventually my brother showed up and said, hey, why don't you come live with me? And so for a couple of years, I just kind of, worked some different odd jobs. I tried first with alcohol, but didn't really have a tolerance for it, was just sick all the time. Smoked some pot and experimented with some different things. My life wasn't going anywhere, so I joined the Army. And it was good in many ways as far as discipline and learning, responsibility and kind of making me OCD. But my last 2.5 years in the Army, I was stationed down in Panama. And this was back in the early 80s. There was no drug testing. Everybody down there did drugs, right? Pot, cocaine. Cocaine was almost free. It was so prevalent down there. And I became addicted, and really badly addicted for a long time, for over a year. Should have died multiple times, because this is really, it's not like the street stuff here. This is very powerful cocaine down there.
When you say it's available, I mean, so did you have to go search for it? Or I'm kind of, the way you painted that picture, I'm imagining all the soldiers, everybody's just at these cocaine parties or
a lot of that going on. There were only 2 people in our company of 160 people that didn't do drugs. That was my platoon sergeant, and that was my company commander, Captain Novak.
Was it like a coping thing? What do you, or just fun? I mean,
it was just everywhere, and everybody did it. I mean, I wasn't even in the country 24 hours, and somebody in the in-processing center had already told me where I could get pot.
Okay.
And my first sergeant, right, that's the highest non-commissioned officer in the company. He was Panamanian, and he could hook you up. Okay.
All right.
Yeah, that's what prevalent means. And I head over heels. I have a very addictive personality, unfortunately. I still smoke cigars, but thank God he's gotten me through everything else. But interesting, that's another story about how cigars has led me to another ministry. But there's some people in our church that I met having a cigar, so I'll just put it that way. But anyway, so I finally went to my company commander one day, and I said, Captain Novak, I said, I'm addicted to cocaine, and it's about to kill me. And he replied with a short 2-word answer that I won't repeat that indicated he was pretty aware of that, since I was his driver and his radio operator. And but he said, I like you. I said, I'm going to send you to see our top psychiatrist here on the base. She works with all the top brass generals, and so she might be able to help you. So I went to see her, and she says, tell me about yourself. So I shared a little bit about what I've shared already, growing up in Vietnam, lost my parents. And I looked up, and she was crying, and she came over, and she gave me a hug. And she says, I want you to know how much you've helped me.
Right. Well, that's what I'm here for, to help you, psychiatrist. That's awesome.
So, I was a little confused, and I'm not here to knock psychiatry. She just, she didn't have the answers that I was looking for, and drugs didn't do it for me. Alcohol didn't do it for me, but I did manage to get out, get an honorable discharge, and I was a good soldier. I completed all of my missions while high, mostly, but I was a good soldier, and so I moved to Florida. It was January, and I wasn't moving from Panama to somewhere snowy, and so I connected with a gal in Panama, and that had been down in Panama, and tried some different jobs. I went through cosmetology school, so
of course
I was going to tell you I could do your hair, but that'd be a lost cause at this point. So,
I believe in miracles.
Yeah.
I don't know.
But then I got a job in sales and realized I had a gift for it, and I started to make a lot of money and become very successful. And I realized that's what I've been missing in my life, is because the world says if you have money, then you can have whatever you want, and if you can have whatever you want, you'll be happy. Yeah,
happiness.
And so I pursued that dream for many years. I got a lot of promotions on up the ladder, and at one point was running, Tennessee and Kentucky for, $1 billion company, and I had it all, and I'd arrived as far as the world was concerned, but I was angry too because the world had lied to me.
Are you still are you addicted to anything at this point? Or were you able to walk away from the drugs and stuff when you got discharged?
No, well, it was too expensive in the States to buy it. So
Okay.
it kind of cleaned me up pretty quick. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so probably still addicted to cigars. I still smoke cigars, but I'm just, so ADD. It's the one thing that can make me sit still for an hour.
Sure.
And enjoy. That's my justification. But
yeah. So now you're working on climbing the corporate ladder and all this, whatever. So what are you carrying? Any other spiritual baggage, or have you walked away from that?
Oh no,
completely?
God wasn't in the picture at all. Yeah, it wasn't in the picture at all. And I always, I forget who came to our church a long time ago. He says, "There's a truth you know, right? It's in there. Whether you want to deny it, denial isn't unbelief.
Yeah.
Denial isn't absence of the truth. It just justifies your position to live like you want, right?"
I like it. I'm going to claim it. I think that was me.
And I was, I'd adopted that. That was my mantra. And it's funny. I was. Can I share a story about how I came to this church?
Yeah.
So,
Well, I mean, you are not going to come in here and not share the story of how you came to this church, because this is gold right here.
Yeah, well, I was playing golf with a friend at the Legends. I was, of course, a member of the Legends Club, and it was all about, all that stuff. And I was playing with a friend of mine, Richard, and we had a pretty good buzz going. And we were on the 5th hole at the Legends, and we caught up to 2 guys in front of us, and there was nowhere to go. There was a foursome in front of them. So they're like, "Hey, you guys want to join us?" And like I said, we had, we tied one over already and 5 holes into it. And we're like, "Yeah, sure, thanks," So we played with them all the way up to the 18th hole, partying the whole way. And we got to the 18th hole, and I guess Richard felt, guilty about something. And he says, "Man, I sure hope you guys aren't preachers or anything." And, Pastor Louis at the time, he looked at me and he gave me that Ronald Reagan response. "Well."
Yeah. And that's when it occurred to you that you were the only ones partying. They weren't partying with you.
Yeah. But, if there was an opportunity to judge or label, we were definitely it, But Louis just saw 2 guys who needed Jesus. And he invited us to New Hope that day. And I'd like to tell you we jumped right on it, but we laughed at him. And, it was a couple years. Sabrina was 8. I think you had just become youth pastor at that point. And I
came a little later, a few more years after.
Oh, that's
Louis.
Miss Sandy. Miss Sandy was here
Miss
first.
Sandy.
Yeah. So, but I wanted something more for her than what the world was selling. I just, and so I remembered New Hope, and I walked through those back doors, and I remember Pastor Paul was senior pastor at the time, and I moved around every Sunday, different pews, so he'd never get a fix on me, of course. But
You're a ninja.
Yeah, for 2 years. I did that, but I was listening, and one day Todd Hutchinson came up to me, and he says, "Hey," "we're doing a study on Wednesday night." We didn't call it connect groups back then, but it would be a connect group. And he said, "We're going to go through Rick Warren's book, Purpose-Driven Life." And I thought about that title for a second because, I wasn't really a man with purpose at that point. I'd succeeded, but it never ends, right? The house is never big enough. The car is never fast enough.
Yeah, right.
And there was just that giant hole still in my heart, And I said, "Well, that's okay. I'll come, So I remember I opened Rick Warren's book, the first sentence on the first page, "It's not about you." I was like, man. But as I read on, I began to understand that I was created with intention, and I was created for purpose. That I've been given a lot of gifts in my life. I love music. I play the guitar. I love sports. Play almost all sports. And God wasn't asking me to put on a robe and become a priest or a pastor. Some are called to that. He was just asking me to use my gifts to reflect back on Him, His glory, and to bless others with what He'd given me. And I think we were about halfway through the class one night. I just fell on my knees and I just surrendered my heart to Jesus.
Yeah.
And I didn't know what it meant at the time, what it would mean, I guess I should say. I knew what it meant. I wish surrender was a one-time event.
Exactly.
One time a week would be good.
It's a repeated and necessary everyday thing.
Every day.
So that's my favorite part of the story, when you accept Christ and you fall on your knees and do that. But you always skip my second favorite part of the story, which was you got invited by Louis at New Hope at the golf course, but then you didn't show up. You laughed at him, whatever. But then you're in an airport. How much later? Is this months later? Is it a year later?
This is probably at least a year, maybe 2 years later.
Okay, so
I'm
let me
a
just,
Christian now.
Okay, you're
I'm
a Christian.
now.
Oh,
I'm
you
on
are?
fire for the Lord. Yes.
You are?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Makes it even better.
Okay.
So I'm in Minneapolis.
Okay, hold on before you say this. I want to say this into the camera. You're not going to believe this, people. You're not going to believe it. This is where he's like, sometimes God says, no, you will follow me.
Yes.
And this is what happened to you.
And I think Louis had already was moving to Montana. Right?
Okay.
So he wasn't still here at New Hope, which makes it even more interesting. So I'm in Minneapolis Airport, and if you've ever been there, it's massive. The Mall of the Americas is in the airport.
Okay.
And they must have 50 bookstores, right? And I've got a layer. I'm going to Des Moines, Iowa for business, some sales call or something. And so I'm in this shop, and I look over at the rack where all the magazines are covered, right?
Oh.
And I'm
Because there's uncovered things in them?
There's uncovered things in them. And great stories.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, that was my line. And I'm just about to reach over to uncover one of the magazines, and I hear, "Tom, is that you?"
That's great. In
And
Minneapolis,
I knew the voice.
Minnesota.
50 bookstores, but he was on his way to Montana.
It was Louis.
Iowa.
It was Louis the whole time.
behind
Golf
me.
course Louis.
And I turned around and I said, "God, is that you?" And Louis said, "Close." Jokingly, of course.
Uh-huh.
And he goes, "How you doing?" And he was just beaming because I was so busted. But it's just funny how God works. And I'd been able to avoid that up to that point, and that was really going to be a moment of weakness. And God just he could have put anybody there, but it had to be Louis, of course.
Yeah. It's unbelievable. Every time I hear it, it blows my mind. I'm just like, that's where, when I've heard you say it before, I was like, okay, God, okay, I get it. You're trying to tell me something here.
Yeah.
So
that was neat.
So you're, of course, you've been a part of New Hope for many years. Your daughter Sabrina, when I did come here, she was a part of the youth group when I was leading that, and seemingly at this point, the chapter on your parents' lives is over, and you've moved on, and then something. How does it come about that the Vietnam contact took place again?
So we had not been able. So the missionary compound became a military training compound at the end of the war, and no one had been allowed back on the property to visit the grave. It had become overgrown. That's just the way the communist government wanted it, forgotten. My oldest brother, David, who became a missionary surgeon in Africa, he was there for over 45 years. He had started writing letters to the Vietnamese government asking for permission for us kids to go visit the grave. 15 years, he never gave up, kept writing these letters.
Wow.
No response. And then in July of 2009, there was a new governor in Bamituit, in that town. And he replied and said, "Okay, you can come. You can come on December 17th at 3:30 p.m.
Oh, well, that's specific right there.
Yeah. So we were kind of excited. Dale, my middle brother, who lives up in Wisconsin, the five of us all went for a little reunion at his house to talk about it. 2009, tough year for me financially. I wasn't going to be able to, really do it without, borrowing some money. My two oldest sisters, Laurel and Judy, they worked in their jobs. They'd already been committed to work through Christmas. So everything was just looking impossible as we talked about it. And then so David said, "Well, let's just pray. If God wants us to go, we'll go. He'll make it happen." And I remember thinking, whatever. So,
and the plan was really they were just going to allow you to come be at your parents' graveside and pay respect to them and all that. Yeah,
correct. So he prayed, and about 1 week later, David lives on the West Coast now. He's retired from the mission field, works with homeless communities there now as a doctor. But he was back in San Francisco area, and he ran into a couple that helped finance his way through med school. And they went, had lunch, and they said, "David, it's been a tough year. This was right after the crash of the market and everything, a tough year for a lot of people. But God's really blessed us, and we feel that there's something He wants us to bless you with." And he says, "Well, I'm a missionary doctor in the jungles of Africa. We always have needs." But he said, "There is this opportunity for us kids to go back to Vietnam, but financially, it's just not doable." And they said, "Well, what do you think it'll cost? And he said, probably $20,000 to $25,000 by the time it's all said and done. And they said, that's it? And they said, you guys go, and we'll cover everything. And 1 week. And then my older sisters had to go to their bosses who had already committed them to work, explain the situation, and that was met with grace, and they were both told, yeah, you can go, and gave them the time off. And so within a week, God had removed all the roadblocks, and he doesn't just answer prayer, and he answers it in style. I remember the three of us, so Laurel and I and Dale, we checked in to Japan Airlines, Chicago, your hometown, and a big wide-body jet. And as we got our boarding passes, we realized we were in executive business class for a 22-hour trip to Saigon. And my oldest sister, Judy, was supposed to be on that flight, but she had mixed up the dates and had missed the flight, so she was going to have to take it the next day, which she later did, but also had an executive business class seat for her trip. And I'll tell you more about that in a minute.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So we fly into Saigon, and we have one. We got in, had some time in the afternoon to walk around the city a little bit, be back in Vietnam. It felt really cool. And we spent the night there, and the next day we got on a smaller twin turbojet, and we flew up to Bami Tuot. And
what's you said it was pretty cool. Was there? It had to be mixed emotions. I mean, or what was it feeling like?
It felt good to be home, because that's where we grew up. That's where I spent more of my time there than in Cambodia. And it was a feeling of just being home, and it felt really good.
Wow, that's cool.
Yeah, and for my sisters as well, just being back in Southeast Asia. And so we got on that little plane, flew up the next day, and I remember the emotions kicked in when we were about to land, and I'm looking down on the city. And so we landed, and when my parents were buried, the pastor of that small Rade church was 22 years old. He's in a photo that when I share the story, I have photos that go with this, and he helped to bury Mom and Dad and the rest of the missionaries. Well, he was there to meet us 41 years later.
Wow. Did your brother, who let him know you were coming?
I'm not sure how all that worked out.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how that worked out, but he knew we were coming. He met us. He and his son met us.
It would be very cool if you would have said an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream.
It may have happened. He didn't let me know.
Okay.
So he meets us. He and his son, they have a couple SUVs, and he said, I have so many beautiful things I want to share with you, but let's get you to the hotel. And then they took us to a really nice hotel. We checked in, we put our bags in the room, and our phones rang. And it was him. He was at the foyer. He says, you need to come back down to the foyer. So we're thinking, okay. So we went down to the foyer, and he says, well, the governor just called, and he wants to meet with all of you tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Well, he'd never said anything about a meeting or meeting with him, right? We just had
governor?
The governor, the one who had granted us permission.
Oh,
to come.
yeah.
So, and he wasn't really asking. So we went the next morning. He sent cars to pick us up, but it was still just the three of us because Judy was still going to be coming in later that day because she'd missed her flight. Dave and Becky, who were in Gabon, Africa, their flight had been canceled, so they were trying to get in later that day as well. So it was just the three of us that went to visit the governor, So we arrive at the palace, and we go into this huge room, and there's these big, kind of like these tables here, but solid mahogany, like 30 feet wide, every table, and there was like 15 of them. And the governor was sitting right there in front of us with his police chief next to him, and all the tables were filled with his entire cabinet.
Wow.
Okay, so all his ministers of religion, agriculture, tourism, I mean, they're all there, right? And there were lights and there were cameras. We were kind of freaking out a little bit. And just the three of us with the Rade pastor. Now, he spoke Vietnamese and he spoke English. So he was going to be our translator because everything we had to do was, translation because I don't speak Vietnamese. And so we stepped up in front of him at this table. And by the way, this was a Saturday morning at 9 o'clock, and his entire cabinet sitting in this room. Now, I don't know if they were suspicious or what was going on. It was kind of interesting. And so he looked right at me and he said, so why are you here? And I immediately said a quick prayer. I said, Holy Spirit, I got nothing,
Yeah.
And so I found myself saying, well, in your culture, it's very important that you honor those who have passed away. And we are so grateful as a family that you've given us an opportunity to come here and do this. And then he turned to my sister and asked her the same question, and she responded in kind, and then to Dale, and Dale said, again, we're so grateful that you've given us this opportunity. And he looked at me and he goes, well, what else are you going to do? Oh, he said, so what are you going to do at the grave? And I said, well, I brought my guitar. We're just going to sing some songs and just honor our mother and father and those missionaries who passed away while we're at the grave. He goes, what else are you going to do while you're here? And I said, well, it's good to be home. He was like, what? What do you mean? I said, well, this is where I'm from. This is where I grew up. And I said, it's so good to be back. And I said, I'm looking forward to eating all the good Vietnamese food again. And I tried to name a bunch of dishes, Tit Con, Bun Bao, and Bun Hoi, and Chai Ho. Vietnamese is a very precise language. It can have the same spelling, one word, but with a different accent changes the meaning. And if you don't say it just right, you are saying something else. And they all started laughing.
So you were definitely saying something else.
I have no idea what I told these guys we were going to eat, but they all started laughing. And so I sensed an opportunity, and after that, the governor did something interesting. He turned to the media and he said, "Get out." And they left. He turned off the microphones. And then he went on to tell us that he had just been promoted to governor about 18 months prior after a big uprising with all the tribal people. He said, in my region, there are 72 tribes that make up, 55 tribes that make up over 70% of my population. He goes, we're the minority here. He says, but the tribal people are very trustworthy and they're hard workers. And he said, we want to incorporate them into our workforce, but he said, because at the end of the war, all their land had been taken away and they'd been pushed out into the jungle, right? So they had no land in the city. They had no status of any kind, right? And so he saw a business opportunity potentially. And he said, you may not know this, we're now the second largest exporter of coffee in the world, coffee beans. I was like, I had no idea. I said, obviously your economy is doing well, your city is beautiful, you have these big wide streets and these big wide sidewalks with, tree planters everywhere. I said, it's a beautiful city. And I meant to say, your minister of agriculture must be proud, but for some reason I blurted out, your coffee minister must be proud. I didn't think it was that funny. They started laughing. I thought the governor was going to need oxygen. They were all pointing at the poor guy. I think from this day he'll always be known as the coffee minister. And they were laughing. But God used that levity to break down walls because we'd only been granted that visit that day, later that afternoon to go to the grave. And David and Judy were still trying to get there, and they were going to miss the whole thing because they weren't going to get in until that night.
Wow.
So I sensed an opportunity, and if we'd been told no special request, you're going to meet the governor, but I sensed an opportunity, and I said they're going to be coming all this way. We've only been given this one opportunity to visit the grave. Would you have the kindness in your heart to consider giving us another visit tomorrow? And he turned to his police chief and he said, let me see their itinerary. And of course, all this is being translated, right? Well, police chief, I didn't know we had an itinerary. Apparently we did. Communist government. So he hands him the itinerary and then he turns to his police chief and he says, you make sure they can go wherever they want, as much as they want, and that nobody bothers them. And then he turned to his minister of religion. It was a woman, and he said to her, I want you to take them now as my honored guest to the best restaurant in the city. And we concluded the meeting, and she did that. She took us to one of the nicest restaurants in the city. I must have gotten some of the dishes right because most of what I said was served to us. And what's interesting is all of the ministers, the governor didn't come, but all of the ministers came and joined us. We had this huge table, and I've got pictures of this, huge table with all the ministers up and down the table with us sitting there with them. And, sharing about our mother and father and their ministry and what they did in Vietnam with the top communist leadership of that area. Yeah. And so it was a long meal. It was about 3 hours. And finally it was over, and I was back in my room. And I remembered a story about Paul being brought in front of King Agrippa. And I didn't know where it was, so it took me a little while to find the verse. And I can't quote it to you right. I mean, I can't name where it is, but it's when he was
brought. It's in Acts.
Yeah. No, I think it's in this one might have. But anyway, what it says, I remember what it says. It says, when you're brought before rulers and authorities, do not worry about what to say, because at that time the Holy Spirit will tell you what to say.
Wow.
And I remember the laughter.
You got it.
And I remember how God delivered us in that meeting. Well, so that was that. So the next day, remember the pastor who met us said he had some things he wanted to show us. So the next morning he meets us at the hotel, he and his son in their SUVs that they picked us up in. So we piled in. It was about a 2-hour drive. Again, they'd been pushed way out into the country and, rough roads, nothing's paved where we're going. And we finally get to the pastor's house and we get out of the trucks and it's Sunday morning. Right? Yeah. And by then my David and Judy had made it in that night. So we're all 5 of us are together. And behind his house is this great big metal warehouse. And I guess which is the church, the home church he was talking about. So, and there were no cars, there were no bicycles, right? I mean, these are, poor people. And so we walk into this building, and it is standing room only, tribal people.
When you say this building, what size building are we talking about here?
Well, just to give you perspective, we walked in, I thought there was at least 500 people in this warehouse kind of building, metal frame warehouse. And as we're walking up towards the front, they're all pointing at us and they're whispering. It was kind of weird. So we got up and we took our seats and David asked the pastor, he said, "What are they saying?" He said, "They call you the children of the sacrifice." I was like, wow. And,
wow.
And then I turned to the pastor and I said, "There must be 500 people here." And he goes, "No, it's about 800. He said, "It's the first of 3 services." That he said, "This is one of 300 home churches, just like it." And so it was time for the service to start. And I remember there were about 5 different choirs. We had the kids' choir came up and sang, and then there was a boys' choir that came up and sang, a girls' choir, and then the adult choir. And then they led worship for 45 minutes, and the whole congregation was singing. I thought that tin roof was going to collapse. It was incredible. Incredible. Oh, by the way, when we walked in there, it was 9:30. And it was not only standing room only, there were people looking in the windows. It was so full, right? At 9:30 in the morning, the service didn't start at 10, till 10. So imagine that.
Yeah.
As we're out last sewing
They were on time. They were on time. It's what my mind went to. I've heard you share this testimony a few times, and I'm sure you've said the children of the sacrifice before, but even when you say it, it just makes you, it stops you in your tracks to hear that.
Yeah.
Especially, and we'll get to this here in a minute, but especially, when I think of Jesus and his earthly ministry and going around and teaching and healing and miracles and all of that. And then when he starts talking about that he's going to lose his life, he's going to be handed over to the officials, he's going to be crucified. That's when his teachings and the parables and things he started doing, that's when the Bible tells us, and the people said, "This is a hard teaching," and they walked away from it. Right. When Jesus goes to the cross, he's there by himself. He's got John and his mother and at the foot of the cross. Even when he rises again, he tells a crowd of 500, "Go wait for me," and only 120 go.
Right.
I mean, so you talk about not having the fruit come from Jesus' earthly ministry.
Right.
But then Jesus also said, "Whoever would come after me, take up your cross, deny yourself, and follow me." And you just think of your mom and dad, and even though I've never met them, just going, my goodness, like faithful servants. I mean,
frustrated. Faithful servant.
Yeah.
Not thinking that their seeds were, accomplishing anything.
And I think frustrated's okay, though.
Yes.
That's the human side of it, right? But perseverance is more important.
Yes.
And they did it. So when you say these are the children of the sacrifice, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Well,
so then we went and had lunch after the service with the pastor, right? And he said something very interesting, caught us totally off guard. He goes, "You remember the Manoan people that your father worked with for 6 years?" And David was like, "Well, how do you know about them? I mean, they're in Cambodia." He says, "No," he said, "long after the war when the Khmer Rouge put many tribal people under persecution in Cambodia, many of them fled across the border into our area, and we've come to know many of them. What your mother and father never knew was that in their tribe, no one can become a Christian unless the family votes on it. And if the family approves it, that individual can can come to Christ. No family can come to Christ unless the village elders vote on it. And if the village elders approve, then the family can become Christian. And no village can become Christian unless the chief, the one who walked in to find your father, approves it. And he said, it just took its time to work through the system. He said, today all 10,000 are believers.
Oh, my. That's incredible.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
And he said, this is your mother and father's heritage, along with those other missionaries, by the way, not just my mom and dad. And, this is their heritage. My mom had a favorite verse. And I forget where it is. I think we talked about it here. Yeah. Why don't you read that?
It's John 12.
And little did she know this would become her legacy.
John 12, verse 24 through 26. And what's your mom's name?
Ruth.
Yeah. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Whoever loves his life loses it, and whoever hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life. If anyone serves me, he must follow me, and where I am, there my servant will be also. If anyone serves me, the Father will honor him.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. To me, that's just a confirmation that our job isn't to save people. Our job is to plant seeds, right? Yes, to be there if someone wants to pray, to receive Jesus, we can walk them through that and help them with that, certainly. But, I'm in sales, so I'm very results-oriented, right? And I've been going to Ukraine for 15 years and sharing my story and participating in sports ministries and things to share the gospel. And so results are very important to me. But I think God has protected me from too many results because then I'd, go to my head to take the credit, right? But the greatest reward is, to go and then, some guy walk up to you and say, by the way, I was a soccer kid that thought you were full of what when you were sharing your testimony. He says, today I'm an assistant pastor because down in the Black Sea, you spent 9 miserable days in the heat with us, and spent time with us and invested in us, and that's what makes it all worth it.
Yeah,
it's
so how many believers total did they tell you?
Over 250,000.
And I'm just Tom. I'm just a big believer in. It doesn't say this in Scripture, but I believe, I think God, with your mom and dad in heaven, pulls that veil back and goes, hey, check this out. Look at that.
Yeah, sure they do.
Look what I did.
I'm sure he does.
Through you.
Yeah.
What a wonderful, wonderful thing, you know? And then for God to give you that completion, to show you that and reveal it to your family too has been...
That was so healing for Judy and for David because, again, they had really struggled with the why. To just... just that there alone was the healing they needed to just let go and realize that these soldiers were doing their job, right? They were doing their job.
Yeah.
You can hate them if you want to, but they were fulfilling God's purpose.
Yeah.
For me to even be able to think or see that way is a confirmation of the transformation that God gives us.
And I've heard you on occasion talk about that the soldier who found your mom and dad has reached out to you.
Yeah, before that. So it was time to go to the grave. And so we went to the grave. Here's what's interesting. We got to the grave. They had cleared it all off. It had been covered, just totally covered up. You couldn't even see it. They cleared it all off, painted the headstones. We get there, and all the ministers are there at the grave waiting for us, including the minister of religion. And so we did what I said we were going to do. I got my guitar out and we sang some worship songs and went to the gravestones and took onion paper and then did tracing over the headstones. It was pretty cool. Spent some time doing that, and then we began to sing some worship songs. And I remember the last worship song we sang. We reached out our hands and we connected hands with all of these ministers around the grave. And we sang, "How Great Is Our God."
Mm-hmm.
Now, we're singing in English, right? Our rabbi pastor is singing in Vietnamese. And so these ministers could hear it. And we're all holding hands with the top communist leadership of that region, singing "How Great Is Our God." And then my brother closed our event by praying, and he prayed over them, and he asked God to bless them, to prosper their government, to prosper their agriculture, and it was just an incredibly powerful. I mean, some of these guys were weeping, and we were about to leave, and the minister of religion comes up to us, and she says she was holding a document in her hand, and she goes, "I needed to share something with you. It's a document. It's been signed by the governor, and he wanted to make sure you saw this." And it was a land grant. It was a land grant for about 7 acres of land in the city for the tribal people to come and build a church within the city.
That's wow. Yeah.
Yeah. And today, these tribal people who were persecuted now have jobs in the coffee industry, now worship freely without persecution.
Coffee minister hooked them up, man. Telling you.
in a church that the communist government ordained.
Wow. Yeah.
So does God have a plan?
Yes. That's what I'm saying. That's why I started this off by going, listen, if you don't believe, this is what you got to hear.
I mean, and that was just, so amazing. But that other part of the story, so we'd been back for about a year. And I get a email from a guy, his name's Tom Catron. He says, "Can we connect?" He said, "I was a soldier in Vietnam. I knew your mother and father." I said, "Yeah, okay, sure." So he gave me his number. I called him, and he goes, "Yeah." He says, "I was in Bamituit when all that happened." He says, "I was he was in charge of the commissary, logistics, right?" And he said, "I knew your mom and dad well." He said, "They would come and sometimes preach at this open-air theater." He'd sent me a photo of him sitting in front of it, and I can't say I really remembered it. And then he said, "Your mom would also invite us after they preached to come to your home, and she would serve coffee and cookies and and she said, so I came to know them very well." He said, "I knew your father very well. We argued many times about God. I was 21, couldn't have cared less, but had fun arguing with him, right?" He says, "But that day, I was in that truck that day that went over to the missionary compound."
Wow.
And he said, "I was a soldier that went down to that hole." And he said, to try to pull the bodies out. And he said, "I tried, but I couldn't." He said, "But your mom was holding on to something. And when I tried to pry their bodies apart, it fell out. It was a Bible. And it was bloodstained." And he said, "I don't know why." He said, "I took it." And he said, "I've had it for 43 years. And he said, I've tried to find your family. I've finally found you guys on Google. Wanted to reach out, wanted to give this to you, wanted you to have it." And so he met with me and he gave me the Bible, and it's now in the Christian Missionary Alliance archives. But all of us 5 up at Dale's house again, we had a reunion and we spent time. We got to look at it, and it is bloodstained. Yeah. And I told him, I said, "Don't you think it's interesting that 43 years after where you and my father left off, you and I have picked up?" Mm-hmm. I said, "God has made you a part of the story because he loves you. Nobody's left out of his story."
Yeah.
And but I just think it's amazing that God used him as a part of our story. But what I think is amazing is that, it's a really cool story, right? It's amazing. But it's just a really little story, and a bit much bigger story, And, they died there that day, but it wasn't the end of something. It was just the start of something,
Yeah.
And when Jesus went to the cross, I'm sure his disciples who were hiding, maybe from a distance, didn't want to be found out, they may have cried out, "God, is this your plan? This is your son. This is the Messiah," and he's bleeding out on a cross. But as we know, that wasn't the end of something. That was just a start.
Yeah.
It was just a start.
Well, and as you continue to tell this story, and when people hear it, new people hear it all the time, the amount of people who come to Christ grows even more. What was your dad's name?
Ed
and Ruth Thompson.
Well, he went by Carl Edward Thompson and Ruth Esther. Yeah.
Okay. And so God continues to use them. Mm-hmm. God continues to bring fruit from the story of the whole thing. And, it's one of the things that makes me think, when you sit down with people and you ask them about their testimony, a recurring theme that happens is people reach a point when they go, "God, show me, I need to know you're there." Mm-hmm. And that's why I always encourage people when they go, "I have doubts, I struggle, I don't know if I believe." I was like, start praying. And they go, "Mm-hmm. Pray what?" Ask God to show you that he's there.
Who he is.
Who he is.
Yeah.
All right? Because all the testimonies you hear over time, it starts with someone going, I made that prayer. And wouldn't you know it, God, that's the prayer God answers. You know, God will step in and show you.
He loves us enough to let us deny him, right? But he's always inviting us into that relationship, you know? I think that's an amazing part, is no one's required to fall in love with Jesus, you know? But when you get to know him, you really have no choice.
Yeah.
Because he came as a humble servant. You know, he came to serve people. I mean, he didn't come to condemn. He came to seek and save the lost, and he did it humbly as a servant. God, you know. And what got me was he gave me everything I thought I wanted, right? I piled it all up in the corner. I had all the trophies, right? I had all the stuff. He let me have it all. And that's what helped me understand that I didn't have anything at all.
Yeah.
You know? And I'm still blessed. I'm still successful in business, but I understand that facilitates the ability to help and to do things with that, to help people.
And that's what you've done.
And I don't do that as a, hey, look what I'm doing. It's just, it's wonderful.
It's your heritage too. I mean, it's in your blood, and to be a servant. And you mentioned you've gone to Ukraine for 15 straight summers, and
except for the last.
Except for the last, right. But then you're also involved in other events. I mean, I know you've served at the Nashville Rescue Mission many, many times. And you're also involved with the Tennessee Action Council, with what we talked about at the beginning, with the Helping Hands event that's happening. And so you continue to serve. And, you know, as we kind of bring this to a close, you know, if there's someone listening out there right now, what word would you say to them? How do you bring this testimony to an end when you're sharing it with an audience?
Well, I would say, you know, I ran for 25 years from God. And he's a God that just, Paul preached on lost sheep, you know. I was that lost sheep, you know, that God went
You're talking
after.
about Pastor Paul.
Pastor Paul.
We had him preach. He preached on lost sheep. That's one of our
on Sunday.
Yes.
And I was that lost sheep. But, I guess, Jesus said grace is beyond human understanding, right? And that means that no matter where you're coming from, what you've done, who you are, God just loves you, and he will forgive you. But more than that, when we trust him with our lives, there's a supernatural transformation that takes place, right? It's not a religion where I decide to become a better person one day, because that's not in me. I can't do that. So, when you talk about I serve and all this, it's just being available, right? Telling God, find a way to use me some way. And a lot of times I don't even realize it till down the road, that some of that happened. And so, trust God that he's going to transform the things in our lives in your life that needs to be transformed, right? People sometimes ask me, is this a sin or that a sin? And I said, look, just seek him out. Whatever needs to be changed, he'll change it.
Yeah.
He'll transform it. You won't even see it happening half the time. It's what he does, And I remember how selfish and ugly and prejudiced I was, and judgmental I was as a person, and that's a miracle he gave me right away, just to see people through his eyes. And, he sees people always in their full potential, like an expectant mother. That unborn child, all you can think about is the potential, right? And that's how God sees us. He doesn't see us on our failures. He knows that.
Yeah.
He sees us in our potential, and that's what he wants for us, right? To use our gifts and abilities for him. And he'll turn you onto those. Yeah. He'll turn you onto those.
It's wonderful.
You've shared your journey.
Yeah.
Right? From baseball to rock and roll star.
Star was never in any of those.
Well, in
titles.
your mind, maybe, but
participant. I got participation trophies, is what I got. So that's good.
But you know what I mean.
Oh, for sure. Well, thank you so much, and I appreciate your story so much. I encourage any pastors and churches that are out there to bring Tom in to share this story, because it changes lives. I mean, there's just so many out there who are struggling with questions. Where's God at? Maybe they even have some anger towards God.
That's the other thing is forgiveness. Is that I heard it the first time from Pastor Paul a long time ago. Unforgiveness is like taking poison, expecting it to kill the other guy, and it just eats you out from the inside out. And Jesus was very pointed about it. He said, your blessing will be removed if you do not let go and forgive. And the blessing is just being able to see the good even in the bad. That's the blessing God delivers. But when you can't forgive, you forfeit that, and that's the sad thing. And so, it's a story about forgiveness too, and understanding that in all things God has a purpose. Even in death.
Call on Jesus, everybody. That's one of the things we want you to know. Call on Jesus,
Amen.
Say that prayer, and let him show up in your life. Thank you, man, for being on here. I don't want to. I'm just gonna say it one more time that this Helping Hands fundraiser it's Voices for the Unspoken event happening on September 21st, 2023. And I have the link for this. I'll put in the show notes for anybody who has an interest or wants to be involved in any way. The band Unspoken will be there. Gonna take me higher, higher.
Funny story, Unspoken, because there's unspoken voices. It links up real well. But I met Chad, the lead singer, on a golf course.
That's where you meet everybody.
Who else that's where God met me, right? Let's not forget. Right? And we became good friends, and I mentioned what we were trying to do, and he says, I'd love to come play your event. So he's going to share his testimony as well.
Oh, great.
Many years struggling with addiction and a lot of things, and God is going to share how God brought him through that, and how God just said, look, use your gifts, use them for me.
Wonderful. Matt Higgins will be a speaker there as well. So it's going to be a good night, everybody. So, hey, thank you, everyone, for listening to this podcast. I really encourage you to share this with other people, because I just think Tom's testimony with his parents and what God did in his life is just one that I can't hear enough. And I'm always so thankful for it. And I think it's a life-changing one that God uses to bring others to him. So the story continues, right?
Amen.
Amen.
Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lord.
Thank you, Lord. Thank you, Lord. So everybody, thanks for listening to the Josh Huisman podcast. We will be here next week with a new episode. But thank you, Tom, for being here today.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thanks.
All right, everybody. All right. Have a great week.